What brought you to the television station?
Well, in the outdoor advertising business, in the 50s and early 60s and middle 60s, I saw so much of the advertising business was going to television that I figured I ought to get in on the act. And the only thing I could get was a couple of bankrupt UHF stations, and so that's what I got. And I tried to make them better.
Let me share a story from the 1920s about future President Herbert Hoover, who at the time was Secretary of Commerce. Hoover had gone from a hugely successful career as an engineer and businessman to global fame for feeding millions during the Great War, where he earned the nickname the Great Humanitarian. As Secretary of Commerce, Hoover oversaw radio's meteoric rise and its growing role in American lives, and believing his name and title carried weight, started urging the radio networks to rein in their commercial impulses. After all, he warned, if the president's message ever became what he called the, quote, meat in a sandwich of two medicine advertisements, end quote, it could destroy both broadcasters' trust with listeners and the president's credibility. Flash forward 40 years to 1964, when President Hoover passed away, NBC aired a tribute to him, which was immediately followed by a beer commercial, a political commercial, and a cigarette commercial. A triple whammy. It was also a perfect example of the meat sandwich Hoover had warned about decades before. Just worse. But here's the thing. No one noticed and no one cared. Because by the mid-1960s, the broadcast networks were printing money. At the same time, in Midtown Manhattan, a new skyscraper designed for CBS by the renowned architect Eero Saarinen opened its doors, signaling a new era in broadcasting. And unlike NBC's 30 Rock just down the street, this building, now known as Black Rock, wasn't made for studio production. No, it was built almost entirely for executives and sales teams. Meanwhile, CBS's TV production was relegated to a milk bottling plant that had been retrofitted outside of Manhattan. You see, the network life was good. But no one really saw what was coming next. They were all kind of asleep at the wheel. And why wouldn't they be? Just 15 years before, in 1949, cable started, like many things do, out of necessity. In a few towns across the country, outside the reach of broadcast TV signals, a few tinkerers had a vision for making television work for their communities. Our story begins in the western Pennsylvania town of Latrobe, with John Walson, an appliance dealer who wanted to sell TV sets. But John Walson had a problem. You see, Latrobe, Pennsylvania was surrounded by hills, and those hills blocked all broadcast signals from reaching his town. Without those signals, his TV sets were little more than expensive boxes with wood paneling. What John Walson needed was a way to show working TV channels to his customers, or he wasn't selling anything. But no matter what he tried, the hills were still in the way. You see, in 1949, in places like western Pennsylvania, hilly terrain made picking up a TV signal nearly impossible without a very tall antenna. But what Walson realized pretty quickly was a regular antenna wasn't going to cut it. He needed more than an antenna. What John Walson needed was a huge tower, hundreds of feet high, in order to pull the nearest broadcast signals from right out of the sky. So what'd he do? He did what most entrepreneurs do when they're faced with a big problem and an underserved market. He figured it out. So Walson built this 200-foot tower and put it on top of Blue Mountain just above Latrobe. From there, he ran coaxial cables straight to his appliance store, where he was finally able to pick up TV signals, even from as far away as Philadelphia. And just like that, ladies and gentlemen, I give you cable TV. Build a super high tower, run some coaxial cable, and let people plug in. And there you go. It was that simple. Suddenly, anyone who bought one of his TVs could connect to his tower and watch the same channels as someone in Philly. In doing so, John Walson had created the world's first community antenna television system, CATV, or what we now know as cable. At the same time, in Tuckerman, Arkansas, and Astoria, Oregon, two more entrepreneurs independently came up with the same solution to their bad signal nightmare. Crazy coincidence? Not at all. History's full of examples where innovators and inventors in different places who've never met stumble upon the same idea at roughly the same time. It's that thing about necessity and invention. In this episode, we'll explore cable's origin story and its early struggles before diving into Ted Turner's bold, naive, and downright crazy TV venture, the scrappy, rinky-dink independent station WTCG. I'm Webb Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
What we're doing right here on this spot is the greatest advance in television since television was invented.
They're risk takers, rule breakers, and empire builders. These are the stories of the visionaries who transform media forever.
Whatever I have is being put at risk on this project, and if it's not successful, I'll be looking for a job.
Going to Bernard Shaw.
Tear down this wall.
From Highbar, this is Media Moguls.
We won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on, we will cover it live.
Hello and welcome back to Media Moguls. I'm Webb Barr. I'm the CEO of Highbar, and I will be your host on this journey through the history of media that we're going to be taking together. I'm a media operator with more than 16 years experience. Now, I am not a historian. I love media history. I just freaking love it. And I'm really fascinated by the history of cable. In the last episode, I covered the early days of broadcast TV, but we didn't get to cable yet. It wasn't the right time. Now it is. You see, the earliest cable systems were very simple. Here's how they worked. Cable providers built super tall antenna towers, often on top of mountains, to grab broadcast signals from faraway markets, since their signals were blocked by obstacles like mountains or vast amounts of space. We're talking mostly in rural areas. From there, cable providers connected their towers to their systems using coaxial cable. Then customers paid a $100 installation fee and an ongoing $5 monthly subscription fee to enjoy the same TV experience that most Americans got for free. Now, throughout this series, I'm going to say words like cable provider or cable operator. They're basically the same. And then I'm going to say cable system. And that's what the cable providers or cable operators own. So when I say cable system, think of Comcast or Charter, like a much simpler version. And when I say cable operator, think John Malone or the Roberts family with Comcast. These cable systems in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were nothing like the cable you know today. Channels like ESPN, CNN, MTV, and TBS were decades away. In the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, if your TV set could pick up network channels, you didn't need cable, which meant cable's TAM, their total addressable market, was actually much smaller than you would think, since they didn't have the differentiated programming or unique channels that could set themselves apart from network TV. Instead, for their first 20 or so years, cable relied solely on pulling network broadcast signals from the sky with their massive towers, operating and growing on a town-by-town basis, mostly in rural areas. So if you have network channels from your regular TV's bunny ears, you don't need cable. And while cable operators knew they could create exclusive channels or programming once their systems got big enough, they also knew it'd be very expensive and insanely risky. Remember, making hit shows and movies is very difficult. It's hard now, it was hard then, and doing it in volume, we're talking a very risky and very expensive game. For now, cable operators focused on expanding into more towns so that they could grow their subscriber base. But in order to reach the next level, cable would eventually need more than just tall antenna towers and the network's programming from the sky. But we'll get to that part in a bit. Still, at its core, in those early days, those first 20 or so years, cable's job was very simple: deliver network TV, CBS, NBC, and ABC, to hard-to-reach towns using antenna towers, and it worked like a dream. I know, it sounds extremely simple, and sometimes these things, when they sound so simple, you're like, it can't be that simple, but it was. By the early 1960s, network broadcasters like NBC, CBS, ABC, as well as the Hollywood studios, realized that cable really had the potential to disrupt things. And not in the same way that, say, the internet would decades later, but more so in a way of, if we don't pay attention to this cable thing, it could become an issue. Here's one of the moments where the Hollywood studios realized cable was a real threat. So you got people in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and they see this movie on their system. But what's interesting about it is it was before the movie was supposed to premiere in that city a few days later. And you're probably wondering, how in the hell did this happen? Well, Scranton's massive antenna tower picked up Pittsburgh's broadcast of the same movie from 340 miles away, just days before its own premiere. Who would have thought, right? Certainly not the Hollywood studios. But since Hollywood licensed movies to local TV stations on an a la carte basis, which is this really big moneymaker for them, which we talked about in the first episode, cable was already proving its power to disrupt and hit their bottom line. By 1964, cable was just 15 years old, but copyright and retransmission issues were already becoming a major problem. And for good reason. You see, cable providers were essentially taking other companies' intellectual property and selling it to their own customers without ever paying for it. On top of that, the networks and movie studios feared a future where more channels and unchecked chaos could disrupt their winning formula. Remember, the network's power came from scarcity, and fewer channels meant bigger returns. So, like any dominant force facing potential competition, what'd they do? They called in reinforcements. In this case, the government, specifically the FCC. But there was a critical flaw with the network's argument on this one. You see, the cable systems weren't actually broadcasting. I love this. Turns out in 1964, the vast majority of cable providers didn't actually transmit their signals over the air. Yes, they pulled broadcast signals down, but they connected to viewers using cables, not over the air. And since the FCC's focus was on regulating over-the-air broadcasting, their response to the networks was pretty simple. Not our problem. So cable kept growing. By 1966, there were more than 1,000 cable systems across the country, which is, of course, when the FCC decided to, change their mind, prompting an important moment for the cable industry. While cable was growing like a weed, it was pretty scattered and disorganized. It was made up of countless small independent operations spread across rural areas of the country. Think about the Old West. I think of Westerns and John Wayne, and that's kind of the cable mentality. But with government intervention looming, cable operators realized they couldn't face the future alone. They needed to band together. So they came together to form what was originally called the National Cable Association. It was a lobby group. Throughout cable's history, one of their greatest strengths has always been their ability to present a united front, rather than leaving individual operators to deal with the government or the networks on their own. They would come together. This new lobby group was a complete game changer. For a fast-growing industry up against heavyweights like the networks or Hollywood, the unity wasn't just helpful, it was necessary. And as you'll see throughout this season, it became a force that shaped the industry for decades to come. One for all for one. Still, in the mid-1960s, cable was very simple, but the opportunity was absolutely massive, and having a collective vision for the industry was the key to unlocking it and creating untold value. Why? Because Americans were obsessed with TV, and they wanted more. And who could give it to them? Could it be the networks? No chance. They didn't have more bandwidth. There weren't more channels coming. Cable was the only way. Now, by this time, we're talking 1966-ish, a number of entrepreneurs were already making plans to create pay channels on cable systems, which included more movies, especially ones that were rarely, if ever, aired on network TV, more sports from across the country, and even film versions of Broadway shows. And of course, they plan to charge customers more for their exclusive, unique programming. Now, when you think about this, doesn't it sound an awful lot like a early version of HBO with a little bit of pay-per-view mixed in? To me, that's what it is. And I assume if you ask people in 1966 if they want to watch more sports or My Fair Lady from the comfort of their home, they wouldn't have hesitated. They would have said, yes, absolutely. But it's not that easy. In Lisa Napoli's book, Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News, she explained, quote, consider the math. Only 600,000 people had seen the smash musical My Fair Lady during its 3-year sold-out Broadway run. If every one of the 107 million households that had tuned in for the live production of Cinderella when it was staged for TV in 1957 had paid just a quarter, the take would total close to $27 million, end quote, which makes a lot of sense. Put it on TV and let's charge people, let's make a lot of money. But things are never that simple. This concept reminds me a lot of what I like to call the Shark Tank fallacy. You know, Shark Tank, the reality TV show where entrepreneurs pitch their ideas to investors. And in almost every episode, someone says something along the lines of, if we can just capture a small percentage of this massive growing market, we'll all get rich. But it's never that simple, right? Well, that same mindset applies here to the mid-1960s plans for these pre-HBO style pay TV channels. And those plans didn't work out either. And it's easy to see why. You see, anyone with any kind of investment in the existing broadcast and entertainment ecosystem, so we're talking about the big three networks, Hollywood, Broadway, they all saw pay TV as a direct threat and massively value destructive to their industries. Why would they help cable destroy their own business? So not only did they refuse to work with cable's pay TV entrepreneurs, but they went straight to the FCC to protect their fiefdoms. This didn't slow cable's growth either. Instead, cable kept growing the same way it always had, town by town and system by system. But in 1968, that growth hit a wall when the FCC, acting on behalf of the incumbents, demanded cable operators start paying copyright fees for retransmitting network shows and Hollywood movies. Remember, cable operators were simply pulling network signals and delivering them to customers who couldn't otherwise get broadcast TV. But here's the catch. Cable providers were retransmitting the network shows and Hollywood movies without ever paying for those rights. And those rights were extremely valuable. Local TV stations across the country paid big fees to license movies from Hollywood or older TV shows from the networks, which then they monetized by running ads. Meanwhile, cable providers were profiting off of all of that programming without ever paying a dime for it. Now, to the networks and to Hollywood, it was theft. It was a lot like 1999 and you're working for Universal Music Group and you find out about Napster. What is that? Oh my God, they're just stealing all our music, right? But to customers, cable was providing a valuable service at a fair price. And it was made possible by cable providers who'd invested heavily in infrastructure, towers and wire, to deliver over-the-air broadcasts that they couldn't otherwise see. It's really interesting, right? It's certainly not a black and white issue. And if you ask me, it's full of shades of gray. Certainly not something the federal government or the court system had really had to think much about before, which left them in a tough spot. Now, remember how I mentioned that the cable providers banded together to stand up to the incumbents? Well, their newfound strength in numbers helped push back against paying those copyright fees, which marked a small victory for cable, but it came at the cost of slowing their own growth. Still, like most businesses or technologies, most government officials didn't really understand cable's potential. Now, one thing that I really found interesting when doing this research was government officials didn't want to look like they were always siding with the networks or Hollywood, especially since all cable was really doing was helping bring free TV to out-of-reach Americans. The government officials had constituents too, And those constituents in out-of-reach areas loved that cable gave them access to TV just like any other American. And that TV, it was free everywhere else, right? So it creates a little bit of a dilemma. You're pulling free television that everyone in America with a network broadcast signal already gets for free, and then offering that same free programming to out-of-reach Americans. It's tough. It's very much a gray zone. Now, battles between incumbents and newcomers are nothing new, especially when new technologies are involved. On one side, you have the incumbents pushing for government regulation, which is just a part of capitalism, I suppose. It's human nature playing out in business. And on the other, you have people trying to build a new paradigm, a new system, and deliver value to new customers. And if this was purely about the law, the incumbents might have buried cable forever in their retransmission and copyright fees. That was totally plausible. But as usual, the government struggled with how or even whether to regulate the young and growing cable industry. In 1968, they chose not to. Since cable was still small and met the needs of so many Americans who were unable to watch TV otherwise, the government chose not to regulate cable, at least for the time being. Instead, they decided to kick the can down the road, where someone else at another time could make the decision. It's classic government. Still, the cable industry did agree to submit to a federal copyright tribunal for determining fair and affordable charges. But even with that concession, much bigger challenges loom for cable. Okay, if history's taught us anything, it's that the biggest opportunities often come in times of chaos and uncertainty, when bold risk takers are able to seize on that chaos and make their mark. It's be greedy when others are fearful, and be fearful when others are greedy. At the end of episode 1, I mentioned how in late 1969, an opportunity landed on Ted Turner's desk that would change the course of history. Calling it the opportunity of a lifetime might be crazy, though, but we are what we make of these opportunities, right? This one came from Jack Rice, the owner of WJRJ Channel 17, an independent TV station in Atlanta, Georgia. Thing is, Rice's indie TV station had no future other than bankruptcy, which was 30 days away. It was no secret around the TV scene that Jack Rice wanted to unload his publicly traded company, Rice Broadcasting. It was a disaster, bleeding $60,000 a month, over $600,000 a year, with no signs of improvement on the horizon. It had no future. Rice Broadcasting was what Wall Street's Gordon Gekko might call a dog with fleas. And like nearly all of the 145 indie TV stations across the country at the time, it was bleeding money. But Rice's bigger problem was finding someone dumb enough to buy his failing indie station. I'll explain why this particular TV station was such a disaster in a bit. But when Ted Turner heard there was a TV station for sale, all it took was one word, television, to get his attention. From there, Ted's stockbroker introduced him to Jack Rice, hoping to solve the failing broadcaster's problem while giving Ted exactly what he wanted, a TV station. The only catch was that Ted knew absolutely nothing about television. I'm going to repeat myself because it's so crazy that someone would spend so much money on a TV station, but Ted Turner knew nothing about TV. He knew nothing about programming television and certainly had no idea what UHF or VHF even meant. But what he was about to learn was that not all TV is created equal. What little Ted knew about TV, he learned from his own billboard, saying, quote, "I never watched any television in those days, but as soon as I heard the TV station in Atlanta was for sale, I got interested right away. Somebody told me it was an underground station, but I didn't even know what that meant," end quote. But he wanted a TV station, you know? Give the guy what he wants, is what I say. TV was cooler, sexier, and way more lucrative than billboards could ever be. And it was a lot more popular and lucrative than radio. And everyone knew that. Everyone knew TV was the future. Downsides? We don't talk downsides with Ted. He wasn't thinking about pitfalls at the time, even though they were catastrophic. But the upsides? Infinity. To Ted Turner, commercials were like moving billboards. They'd be fun to sell and full of potential. Plus, he had a plan. Just like his radio stations, he was going to cover Channel 17's losses with the profits from his billboard business while using his empty billboards to promote his TV station across Atlanta. It seems like a good plan, right? Well, for almost any other TV station, yes, it would have been a good plan. But WJRJ wasn't just any station. When Ted's advisors heard about his plan to merge Turner Advertising with Rice Broadcasting, they lost it. A $2.5 million stock swap was insane. The station's annual losses were already massive, and Ted was risking their futures and reputations along with his own. Turner accountant and family friend Erwin Mazzo summed it up best when he said Rice's bankers, quote, walked into Ted's office and knew right away they had found their man, end quote. Now, this whole ordeal reminds me of the scene at the beginning of National Lampoon's Vacation with Chevy Chase, when Clark Griswold goes to pick up the Antarctic Blue Super Sports Wagon with CB and optional rally fun pack from a very suave salesman played by Eugene Levy, only to be told,
I know what must have happened. It didn't come in.
Ed, I'm not your ordinary everyday fool, okay? Now, I'd like my Antarctic Blue Super Sports Wagon right now, and if you can't get it for me, I'm going to take my business elsewhere. Where's my old car?
I'm just as upset as you are, believe me. I can get you the wagon. There's no problem there. The problem is it might take 6 weeks. Now, I owe it to myself to tell you, Mr. Griswold, that if you're thinking of taking the tribe cross-country, this is the automobile you should be using, the Wagon Queen family truckster. You think you hate it now, but wait till you drive it.
Ted was caught hook, line, and sinker. Mazzo added, quote, we were certain Ted had gone crazy this time. That TV station was hemorrhaging, and we could see the whole company being pulled down with it. God almighty, the station was 30 days of going off the air, but Ted had already decided he was going to buy it. We tried everything we could to keep Ted from buying that station. We didn't have any money to lose in a television station. I had been through one big crisis when he took back the billboard company from Bob Nagley, and I said I just couldn't take it another time. It was just an atrocious business proposition, end quote. Think about it. All of Ted's advisors, including Erwin Mazzo, who's a family friend, felt this deep sense of responsibility born out of years of friendship and loyalty to Ted's father to save Ted from himself. And yet Ted pushed forward. Mazzo warned Ted, quote, if this deal doesn't work out, everything will collapse. Everything you've got will be gone. We don't want to put it all on the line because the result cannot possibly be worth the risk, end quote. And yet, the more his advisors were against the deal, the more Ted Turner was convinced he had to do the deal. Relentlessness, tenacity, conviction. These are the traits that every entrepreneur needs. The greatest ones have in spades. Even when loved ones, trusted advisors, and everyone else tells you not to move forward, you do it anyway because you believe, and that belief drives everything. This isn't the kind of work for everyone. Trust me, I'm doing it right now, and people think I'm crazy to have this kind of show that's so long. But I think that's what differentiates it. I'm not the best on the mic. Sometimes the quality is not so great, but I'm roughing it. You got to push forward. So despite everyone telling him to walk away, Ted moved forward. Now, this is going to be a recurring theme this season. But from here, Ted devised a plan to buy Rice Broadcasting's struggling independent TV station, one with no future, for no cash down, but plenty of debt. Ted's intuition, while naive, told him even though TV was the fastest growing medium, there was still a lot more room to grow. It was still in the early innings, so to speak. He believed that TV station licenses were going to skyrocket in value, potentially being worth a fortune in a few years. Plus, he could use the profits from the billboard business to cover the cost of the station. At the same time, Ted figured it was only a matter of time before TV revenue started cutting into his billboard business. But here's the thing. Ted Turner didn't just buy an indie TV station, which on its own would have been a very smart move. This wasn't cable, and it definitely wasn't a lucrative local network affiliate. No, Ted Turner bought an indie UHF station, and UHF stations were a completely different beast. Ted later confirmed, quote, "I had no idea what UHF stood for, but the owner had taken a billboard and I read it on the board. I could feel it was right. Television," end quote. Now, a few minutes ago, do you remember when I said not all TV is created equal? Well, here's what I meant. By the 1960s, the prime real estate on the TV dial was channels 2 through 13. And all of these were on the VHF frequency, which stood for very high frequency. I can't make it up. It's that simple. I love old school terminology and acronyms. Heck, my own name is an acronym, WEB. You see, network affiliate stations were all on VHF, and for them, making money was easy. After all, there's only so many channels on those old school dials, right? 2 through 13. In Lisa Napoli's book, Up All Night, she explained how, quote, network affiliation equaled access to star-studded programs with higher production values than stations could produce on their own, including a nightly national newscast to complement the local headlines. It also meant adhering to the network's schedule, a worthy trade-off for the audience these shows commanded, translated into bountiful ad sales for all, end quote. So the national networks out of New York, ABC, CBS, NBC, have all these local affiliates in all these towns across the country. In Atlanta, there's 3 local affiliates. They are affiliated with a national network, one of ABC, CBS, and NBC. And the national networks give them most of their programming. They are able to keep some of the programming, like local news, local sports, some syndicated TV shows and movies that they can license from Hollywood and the networks themselves. And in turn, they make a lot of money together. Now, on the flip side, there was Ted's station, which was on the UHF frequency, which stood for ultra high frequency. One would think that ultra high frequency would be better than very high frequency, and one would be wrong. Now, UHF was introduced to customers in the mid-1960s. Sadly for those station owners, ultra high was not an upgrade over very high. It was much worse than that. You see, VHF stations had stronger signals than UHF, even though UHF was a newer technology. And VHF was better positioned on the TV, sitting above the UHF dial on the TV. So if you saw the UHF dial, you wouldn't even touch it. By 1969, fewer than half the TVs in Atlanta could even pick up a UHF signal. Even worse, they were viewed by less than 5% of the homes in the Atlanta area. So being a UHF station wasn't some minor inconvenience. It was a total disaster. Now, if you're under 35, you might not remember this. I mean, if you're under 45, you might not remember it. But before remote controls, TVs had physical dials. And if you wanted to change the channel, you had to get off the couch and actually turn the dial yourself. It was a legitimate physical lock-in. And that's why VHF, even though it was older, had such a huge advantage. It wasn't just technologically better, it was the standard. Meanwhile, UHF, despite its fancy name, had a weaker signal, didn't travel far, and reached a significantly smaller audience. Ted tried his best to put his own spin on UHF, saying, quote, UHF viewers are more intelligent than the people who watch the other stations. Only an extremely smart person could figure out how to work that antenna in order to tune into a UHF station like ours, end quote. Or only clueless investors with money to burn would ever sink their money into a UHF station. Terry McGurk, Ted's protege and longtime Turner employee, said it better. Quote, working in UHF television at that time was like being in the French Foreign Legion, end quote. Consider this. As Ted's leap into TV was directionally correct, well, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Yes, TV was the future. Its growth was obvious and explosive, and there was plenty of opportunity. Some stations were bound to skyrocket in value, but buying a struggling UHF station, the absolute last place station in Atlanta, was insane. So I don't like to second guess or play backseat driver, but Ted shouldn't have bought the station. And if he had known what he knew, say 2 years later, he never would have done it. But that's how so many of these ventures go, right? At the time, you underestimate the amount of effort, time, and pain it's going to take just to grow and win. And I haven't even mentioned the competition in the Atlanta market yet. You see, Atlanta already had 3 VHF stations, as well as one better-funded indie UHF station. No one thought Atlanta could sustain 2 independent UHF stations, let alone one. But against all odds and logic, on September 9th, 1970, Ted moved forward, borrowing heavily, officially acquiring Atlanta's money pit of an indie station, Channel 17, WJRJ, in a deal structured as a reverse merger with Rice Broadcasting, absorbing Turner Communications by issuing $2.5 million of Turner stock. Once the deal was finalized, Ted wasted no time rebranding Rice Broadcasting as Turner Communications. And while he wanted to name his station WTBS, a small Boston radio station already owned the call letters, so instead he changed WJRJ to WTCG, short for Turner Communications Group. And with that, Ted Turner was officially the owner of a public company, and I guess you could say he was a television mogul now. The thing was, his station had no audience, zero awareness, and barely any programming. On top of that, it was hemorrhaging over $600,000 a year, and it was in last place in Atlanta. But the upside? Well, that was all they had. Nothing but up, right? Ted later said, quote, "I wanted to do more with my life than just make money. I thought that television would be more exciting and more interesting," end quote. And I think that's absolutely right. It's his money. Now, remember, not all TV was created equal. Owning a UHF TV station wasn't a golden ticket. It was closer to a Powerball ticket. But Ted Turner was going to succeed or die trying. And soon I think you'll understand why. Now, I have a little bit of an exercise I'd like for you to participate with me in. I'd like for you to close your eyes. Are they closed? Good. Now, I want you to imagine what an independent TV station in 1970 looked like. What do you think Ted Turner's office looked like? Was it nice? What kind of shows do you think they were airing? Okay, now I want you to picture modern offices, like Netflix's sleek headquarters in West Hollywood or Meta's sprawling campus in Menlo Park. Beautiful. Okay, now open your eyes. Whatever you just imagined about WTCG's offices in Atlanta was significantly worse. They're the complete opposite of the polished, cushy spaces that we're lucky to work in today. But once the merger was finalized, Ted moved the station to 1018 West Peachtree Street, a flea-ridden concrete bunker that served as a starting point for his TV empire. Brick by brick, right? Or cinder block by cinder block is probably more apt. In 1970, WTCG had around 30 employees, each earning around $30 a week. Ted's protege and longtime Turner Broadcasting executive, Terry McGurk, recalled that the station was burning through about $50,000 a month. So yeah, finances were really rough from the start. So what did Ted do? Did he spend a lot of money? Did he start making new programming? No. He doubled down and bought another indie TV station in 1971, this time in Charlotte, North Carolina. And once again, his advisors were furious. And rightfully so. For them, this was the last straw. It even caused his family friend and accountant, Erwin Mazzo, to resign after he refused to support Ted's Charlotte deal. Not one to tolerate dissent, Ted bought each of them out and kept moving forward. Me? I wonder if he even thought twice. Seriously. Ted Turner was a man on a mission. If you weren't on board, you were shown the door. Lead, follow, or get out of the way. It was on a plaque on his desk from day one. Still, Ted kept perspective, saying, quote, "It's pretty tough when your own accountant quits because he thinks you're doomed," end quote. Even without Erwin Mazzo, the board vetoed the Charlotte deal. So what did Ted do? Did he cut and run, give up? Nope. He went ahead and bought the Charlotte station himself. And to seal the deal, he took on $3 million in debt and used his Turner Communications stock while mortgaging his house as collateral. Once the station was his, he renamed it WRET, which were his father's initials. I'm sure you're wondering, okay, so he already owns a UHF station in Atlanta. It is a total disaster. Why is he doubling down and buying another TV station? What made this so appealing? Well, it was actually kind of an accident. You see, WRET had great color broadcasting gear for color TV, exactly the kind of gear that Ted was looking for his Atlanta station. So when he went to Charlotte to buy the equipment, he didn't just leave with the gear. He ended up buying the entire station right before it was about to be liquidated on court steps. Still, Erwin Mazzo later admitted, quote, "Ted went against every piece of advice I gave him, and he was always right. Everything he touched turned into a success," end quote. Sure enough, WRET in Charlotte was another dog. Just this one had even more fleas. So, how bad were things at WRET in Charlotte? Pretty bad. Commercials on Charlotte's WRET went for just $25 a spot versus $800 per ad spot at the competition. Meanwhile, the station was also hemorrhaging $50,000 per month. Things were so bad that Ted eventually resorted to holding what he called a begathon. Now, I love this whole concept, and I'm sure you're asking, what in the world is a begathon? Well, I'm going to let Ted describe what a begathon is, saying, quote, "I had to actually go on the air in Charlotte and solicit loans from viewers. I said it's a telethon. A telethon for me because I need money to get the wolf away from the door. The telethon took in $35,000. But you know what? I paid back all of those people. If I ever need any money in the future, I know how to get it. I'll just go on TV and say, 'I'm Ted Turner, and please send me some money. I promise to pay it back with interest,' end quote. But here's where it gets even more amazing. More than 35,000 people tuned in that day, donating anywhere from $25 to $100. By the end of the day, Ted had raised nearly $50,000. And yes, all of this sounds absolutely crazy, but here's an indication of just the kind of person Ted Turner was. He kept all the names and addresses of everyone who sent in money, and years later, when he sold WRET so that he could finance CNN, Ted Turner paid everyone back. Desperate stunts aside, let's not forget that Ted Turner owned two struggling, dead on arrival, money-losing UHF TV stations, one in Atlanta, Georgia, and the other in Charlotte, North Carolina. And still, throughout all of this, he was having the time of his life. You might as well, right? I mean, what's the point of being miserable while you're building a company? These were his choices, and he was pursuing history. He was going for it. Might as well enjoy it. By now, I'm sure you've realized that Ted really lived for competition. It was in his DNA. He thrived on it. So, of course, there was no way he was going to let his father's old school friends and advisors rain on his parade. He was going to make it work his way. You see, Ted was already a world-class sailor. And while I'm not going to discuss sailing at length today because I don't really know much about sailing, it only deepened his drive to win at all costs. Whether on land or at sea, he trusted his gut. And so far, it hadn't let him down. Still, even in early 1971, Ted knew that taking on 3 major network affiliates, as well as another indie UHF station in Atlanta, was going to be a very uphill battle. Both UHF stations were severely underfunded, each losing nearly $1 million a year. Turns out, in 1971, of the 146 UHF stations across the country, 99 of them were operating in the red. But Ted had a big advantage. If you remember in episode 1, I mentioned that 15% of Turner's billboards sat unused at any given time. Well, those unused billboards were a game changer for Ted to promote his TV station, which gave him an actual edge in the market as much as it could. But that wasn't all. You see, Ted had an uncanny knack for stretching the dollar. It was actually one of his superpowers, and it's going to play a huge role in his battles against better funded competitors throughout his career. I love telling stories of thriftiness because when you're up against the Goliaths, you have to think differently. Now, you're probably thinking, how does a guy who regularly disappears from the office for months at a time, which is true, to compete in the world's biggest sailing competitions, which aren't cheap, save money? How does he do that? Where's that come from? It's a great question. Well, when it came to WTCG, Ted was a master at squeezing every last penny out of his resources. For example, he wouldn't even let employees buy new videotapes for making commercials, even though those were pretty cheap. Instead, he had them erase old tapes from shows like Divorce Court and reuse them. What's old is new again. These were tactics never used at the networks, who just bought new tapes. Money was never an object at the networks. His frugality wasn't limited to the office. He brought it home with him too, where his wife, Janie, often complained that Ted banned air conditioning in their house. Keep in mind, they were living in the South. It's really hot there, especially in the summer. And his thriftiness didn't stop there. For years, he was known to cut his own hair, which is either this amazing commitment to the bit or just a love for saving money on what he saw as unnecessary costs. It also adds to the folklore, if you know what I'm saying. I get it. I mean, some things we're frugal about and other things we're not. I'm recording this in my parents' house right now because in Manhattan, it is $300 an hour to record a podcast. Back at WTCG, Turner's CFO, Will Sanders, who was a financial genius and a bit of a lifeline for Ted, kept the company afloat by securing bank loans while selling off assets, like Ted's Roanoke Billboard Company for $2 million and some of the radio stations they'd bought in 1969. To outsiders, all of this looked like more Ted Turner recklessness, shedding profitable businesses like billboards and radio stations just to keep a last place UHF station alive. Seemed like throwing good money after bad, right? Lighting money on fire. And yet, as the company shed these non-TV assets, its value grew. By 1971, Turner Communications was worth at least $12 million, even though all they aired at the time was an endless supply of old black and white TV shows and movies, which I'll get to in a bit. Some way, somehow, Ted's station stayed in the game, largely driven by sheer determination. Eventually, Ted would say that his station's call letters, WTCG, stood for Watch This Channel Grow.
This is WTCG Television, Atlanta.
But in early 1971, they weren't really growing at all. That is, until March 31st, 1971, when Ted Turner got a call from God. Atlanta's other indie UHF station, WATL, was shutting down. Their owners decided UHF just wasn't sustainable, especially with the big three network affiliates dominating the Atlanta market. For Ted, this was an unexpected stroke of luck. And even though WATL outperformed his station, they weren't able to make a dent in the network's ratings. So they threw in the towel. Now, Ted was never one to waste an opportunity to inspire his troops. We're going to see this over and over. So he declared victory over, quote, superior forces with bottomless pockets, end quote. Then celebrated with a live on-air Thank You Atlanta party, which sounds both incredible and hilarious. Now, I'd love to know just what the ratings were for Ted's Thank You party, because as big of a deal as it sounds, it probably was not. I doubt more than 1,000 people have ever even seen it. And that's really just how bleak things were. But still, WATL's exit from Atlanta in 1971 was a huge win for Ted Turner and Channel 17. Instead of 5 TV stations in Atlanta, there were now 4, and Ted's was the only one unaffiliated with the national network. And while that doesn't sound like this huge step up, he's still running a UHF station, its implications for him were pretty big. In fact, this is the kind of moment that, looking back, separates the career operators punching the clock from the bold founders and entrepreneurs really going for it. Anyways, now Ted could finally counter-program his competition and give Atlantans a real alternative to the network's largely homogenous programming. Now that WTCG was the only independent station in Atlanta, Ted could zig when the network zagged and offer viewers programming they couldn't get anywhere else, which, when you think of it, is a much smarter way to grow an audience than simply copying the network's programming strategies, schedules, and content, right? Now, I need to step back for a second and clarify what I mean by counter-programming. Imagine the networks are airing something serious, like their national news. He might counter with Star Trek or a Marx Brothers movie at the same time. He's offering an alternative. Still, even with his counter-programming strategy, Ted faced an enormous uphill battle. He was a UHF station against networks on VHF in Atlanta. And yet, strategically, he was in a far better situation than before. He finally had a real competitive advantage against the local networks. And with that, Ted had an opportunity. And sometimes, that's all it takes. So, what was Ted really up against? Well, in his own words, quote, "The 3 other commercial stations in Atlanta all had network money behind them, and they all programmed pretty much alike. I believe that people are tired of violence and psychological problems and all the negative things they see on TV every night. I felt like the people of Atlanta were entitled to something different," end quote. You see, these local stations, which were affiliated with ABC, CBS, and NBC, they had new movies, TV shows, and live sports. But honestly, not much set them apart. I actually think that's still the case. Try to tell me otherwise. Still, TV in the early 1970s was light years different than what you're probably thinking. Remember, when a network aired a new TV show, that was it. If you missed an episode, you probably never saw it again. It was basically gone forever. For my entire life, and even decades before, ABC, CBS, and NBC have had pretty much the same daily programming schedule featuring morning show, daily soaps, local news, nightly news, primetime TV, local news, late night show. Well, Ted didn't have any of those, but he did have something else, and it was very powerful too. A blank slate. Okay, hear me out. It's not always a massive advantage to have decades of institutional experience with much bigger budgets and headcount. I'll discuss this a lot in future episodes, but it's a major part of why internet companies with just a few people were able to defeat massive legacy companies, and doing things differently than ever before is a major part of that disruption. This blank slate gave Ted the opportunity to do things differently. By offering Atlantans a real alternative to the networks, he had a shot. Think about it. If you're going to compete against the networks with their deep pockets, brain power, and incredible institutional advantages, including with the United States government, borderline monopolistic, would you make your own TV shows or movies? You know that's really risky and expensive. Would you copy their programming schedule and be a lesser version of them? Of course not. Those would be the worst strategies possible. It's so hard to break through offering just a cheaper, lesser version of something like network TV. Instead, you have to do things very differently and keep your costs low. And so in the early 1970s, with no money to spare, Ted himself decided to take the local networks on in Atlanta by counter-programming them with a slate of nonstop, cheap, old black and white TV shows, most of which hadn't been seen for years, along with movies that hadn't been seen outside of movie theaters in decades. And while other TV stations thought these shows were basically relics of the past, Ted thought they were gold. Think about it. Airing all of these old black and white movies and TV shows was much cheaper than producing his own original programming and hoping things stick. It's a classic example of one of my favorite maxims of how constraints breed creativity. Now, I get that in 2025, black and white reruns don't sound very sexy or cool, but there were plenty of people in Atlanta who still wanted to watch older TV shows, like the Andy Griffith Show, which TBS, mind you, still airs. And they couldn't before because they weren't available anywhere else. What Ted Turner was doing was providing a real alternative. Remember, in 1971, there's only 3 networks. There's no DVR, VHS, Blockbuster, or anything like that. You couldn't record anything. It was here today, gone forever. Here's where Ted Turner's genius really shines through. In the early 1970s, financially strapped TV stations like his normally licensed old shows on an a la carte basis for a limited number of airings. Once the show aired, the rights would then revert back to the owners. But Ted never wanted to follow convention. Instead of licensing shows, he bought programming outright whenever he could. Owning the product, which was the programming or TV shows or movies, meant Ted could air it as often as he wanted, which spread the cost over hundreds of showings. And while it was more expensive up front, very few people at the time really understood what he was doing or why it mattered. Today, it's a large aspect of Netflix's content strategy, if you think about it. So, by owning the programming whenever possible, Ted gained a powerful advantage that would eventually make WTCG the most profitable TV station in the country. So, how was he able to execute this plan, reusing old unwanted TV shows to his advantage? Well, almost immediately after buying WTCG, in 1970, Ted flew to Hollywood to visit all of the studios. He was on the hunt for product, cheap product, any product. And by product, I mean programming, shows, and movies. And just picture it. You're a studio executive in Hollywood and you're working at a legendary studio like MCA or Paramount, Lou Wasserman style, or even Bob Evans. And you know, places with decades of Tinseltown history and prestige. And on the other side of the table is a 30-year-old Southerner with a thick accent, a mustache, and barely any experience in movie licensing and deal making. And he's there to make a deal. He's there to get his hands on as much product as he can for the worst performing TV station in Atlanta, Georgia. It's like an early 1970s Anchorman-esque version of a scene from The Big Short, where Christian Bale's character, Michael Burry, goes to Goldman Sachs, and he asks them if they can create a product so he can short hundreds of millions of dollars in subprime mortgage bonds. And what do? They laugh their asses off. And then the Goldman bankers say, "Of course we'll help you." They all think this guy's crazy. Well, to me, that's kind of what Ted's first foray into Hollywood was like. He even admitted, quote, "They helped me whenever they could," end quote. Of course they did. The studio supplied Ted with old programming, stuff that no one else really wanted, just like Goldman Sachs and Michael Burry's subprime credit swaps. Ted ended up with a grab bag of shows like Star Trek, The Beverly Hillbillies, Gilligan's Island, and The Andy Griffith Show. I had that music playing in my head right now. Along with a library full of black and white westerns and horror films. One of Ted's sales managers said he, quote, "didn't mind overpaying for programs he bought. He made a lot of friends in the industry by overpaying. People liked working with him. He would take the product and sometimes never even ask the price," end quote. I mean, that's kind of crazy, not asking the price. But the key was that Ted was buying film and TV libraries before anyone else realized it was better to own than license. Today, shows like Friends or Seinfeld can fetch licensing fees of over $1 billion. But in the early 1970s, there was hardly a market for old movies and TV shows, with some Hollywood studios even valuing their film libraries at $0. You see, the studios didn't see the same long-term value for their libraries because outside of rare movie theater screenings or local TV stations licensing one by one, there really was nowhere else for them to air their old movies. Remember, VHS is still a decade away, which meant there's no movie stores to rent movies like Blockbuster. It's just the big three networks and their affiliates, plus stations like Ted's. Just very few, if any, programmed their stations like Ted did. At the time, most stations followed the model of licensing movies, and after they aired it one or two times, for that set price, the rights went back to the owners. What Ted saw was a much bigger and better opportunity, and his vision was as bold as it was groundbreaking. Ultimately, he made it a policy at Turner Broadcasting to own content whenever possible, believing it was the key to their long-term success. You see, at Turner Broadcasting, there were no committees or panel discussions. Ted made decisions like this, and everyone moved forward.
When I make a decision after listing all the facts, if it's a decision I want to make myself, then I make it and that's it until it's proven wrong. And then if I'm wrong, I'll admit it and change. It's like sailing a boat. You pick the course that you think's going to be best. It doesn't always work out, but, you know, with a boat, there's got to be one captain when it comes down to making decisions, or you won't get anywhere. You know, Nelson ran the fleet, didn't he?
I can't say this loud enough. When you're up against the odds, committees are really where good ideas go to die. Trust me, I've seen it firsthand so many times I can't even count, where you take an idea that has some legs, but it's not totally all the way there, and throw it into a committee where it would die a long, slow death, or get watered down so much that the genius of the idea, this little kernel of an idea, just ceases to exist. I am not a committee fan. Another person who's not a committee fan was the legendary ad man, David Ogilvy, who wrote in Confessions of an Advertising Man, quote, "In my experience, committees can criticize, but they cannot create. Search the parks in all your cities. You'll find no statues of committees," end quote. To me, this is really what Paul Graham meant when he wrote his now famous founder mode essay. You know, it's get busy building or get busy dying. Ted didn't need to run his ideas or initiatives by a group of people who are going to be playing it safe. No, he would simply declare them and they would become the company's philosophy. Sure, it's a lot of power, but this is how things get done very often in companies. 2 decades later, a Turner executive summed up the philosophy as a key to their success, saying, quote, "We control more of our own software than any other programming entity in the world. We're really in the business of remarketing product. We buy as much software as we can, and we find as many ways to get it out there," end quote. Now, he said that when they had a number of cable channels, but the point remained, they would buy their programming and spread it across their entities. They tried to squeeze every ounce of value out of every programming asset that they had, whereas there's a reason for many years that Netflix never did sports, and it was, well, you only air it once and it becomes valueless right after you air it. You see, when it came to programming, Ted's strategy was very simple and consistent from the start. Own as much of the content as possible, because it is better to control your own destiny than to be constantly renegotiating licensing fees just to keep your channel running. And that makes a lot of sense. From there, Ted built his channel around counter-programming the networks, filling WTCG's schedule with owned and operated classics. You know, the Gilligan's Islands, the Andy Griffith Show, Leave It to Beaver, and airing those around the clock. Of course, they did license some shows, but eventually Ted owned the rights to so many movies that if he played them back to back, they'd fill more than 1.5 years of airtime. Y'all, that's over 3,000 movies. He liked to call it escapism, And his pitch to advertisers leaned on the wholesome, all shucks charm of WTCG's family-friendly programming. He focused on family values, and while he had to basically ignore the ratings entirely because they were so low, he still wanted to position his channel as a better alternative to the competition in Atlanta. Now, Ted Turner's sales skills are legendary. He is a one-man wrecking crew who pitched WTCG to advertisers by focusing on his unique programming, not their ratings. His argument to advertisers was Leave It to Beaver was a better ad buy than the sitcoms on the other networks because everyone knew Leave It to Beaver. Now, that is a bit of a stretch because ratings and audience demographics do matter, but Ted could sell sand to the Sahara. He loved to tell advertisers, quote, "Look at me and what do you see? A winner, right? Turn your umbrellas upside down, fellas, and stand here next to me. This is where the gold's going to fall," end quote. Gosh, I love that kind of quote. Not only that, he thrived on competition. Looking back on the early days saying, quote, "I programmed the whole station myself in those days. I sold ads. I signed all the payroll checks. I went to parties. I met people. I asked a million stupid questions and I educated myself. I would wander around in a daze all day thinking, what am I going to put on at 4:30? No committees, no studies, no bull. I would ask Janie, his wife, what she thought of a certain movie or one of my friends or the girls at the office. Not too scientific, huh? Well, I still program my own movies and I still do it the same way. And it still works," end quote. Amazing, right? Another one of Ted's biggest programming coups in WTCG's earliest days was securing the rights in 1971 to Georgia Championship Wrestling from ABC. And while the other stations in Atlanta mocked him for airing pro wrestling, Ted got the last laugh. Professional wrestling on WTCG was a massive hit, outperforming the #1 local newscast by over 50% and claiming the championship belt of the highest rated show produced in the city. And not only that, Ted made it even more cost effective by hosting and filming live professional wrestling matches 3 nights a week directly from WTCG's cramped cinder block rundown studio. Now, professional wrestling has always fascinated me because, well, it's fascinating. It's always been a cornerstone in the growth of television, from cable channels to streaming services. It's no surprise that Netflix's first long-term live sports deal is with World Wrestling Entertainment, or WWE. Throughout wrestling's history, its model of scripting unpredictable outcomes for the audience, just like sports, while having a largely predictable cost basis, has been a key to its success. Add in their weekly passionate fan base, and it's a proven way for cable channels and now streaming platforms like Netflix to build consistently loyal, repeat viewers that don't unsubscribe. It is a churn blocker. So yeah, wrestling's a good business to be in with predictable economics if you're a budding TV station in the early 1970s. We might have to do an episode on Ted Turner's World Championship Wrestling later. Let me know what you think in the comments or DM me at @webbar. Anyways, wrestling was the first major catalyst for WTCG to build a loyal audience that came back to the channel. And despite the challenges of UHF and its terrible user experience on the TV dial, the ratings started to climb. But that wasn't it. I'm not exaggerating when I say that professional wrestling, what some people call fake, others call ballet, soap opera for men, was really the start for Ted Turner's bold ambitions in sports broadcasting. It's a world he'd go on to reshape and revolutionize. But that's the story for the next episode. Okay, moving on. In addition to Ted's black and white films and TV reruns, as well as professional wrestling, one of their biggest programming coups actually came from NBC in New York, the parent Peacock channel, and it changed WTCG's fortunes forever. Here's the story. Atlanta's NBC affiliate, WSB, was the number one station in Atlanta. But they started turning down some shows from their parent network in New York in lieu of airing more locally produced programming, which was, of course, more profitable because it was cheaper to make. And this is their prerogative. It's totally fine, and I'm sure it happened all over the country with a lot of affiliates all the time. No big deal. But what makes this interesting, the fact that they're turning down shows and sitcoms from NBC, is that this time Ted Turner was involved. Remember, no one in Atlanta even knew these shows existed. So Ted figured, why not try to make a deal with NBC? No downside, you know? And that's what a lot of people miss these days. Why not? Ted knew in order to level up, he was going to have to take much bigger swings. So when he got the chance to air new NBC shows on his channel, well, that's an opportunity he can't turn down. So he jumps into action and strikes a deal with NBC in New York for a package of 5 NBC sitcoms. The Peacock Network was more than happy to have anyone air them in Atlanta. If WSB isn't going to air them, why not, Ted? It's easy money for them. As soon as the deal is signed, Ted then goes to his billboards in Atlanta, where he boldly announces, quote, the NBC network has moved to Channel 17, end quote. By airing NBC's Castaway shows on WTCG, Ted gave Atlantans something they otherwise wouldn't have had, but it also tied NBC's high-quality programming to his rinky-dink station. And then using his own billboards to say so boldly that their programming is now on his station is a stroke of genius. Ted said, quote, we felt we could shake them up a little, let them know we're in the race, end quote. I think he did just that. And that's how it's done. Ted used the network's own programming against them to grow awareness for his station and drive his own ad revenue. It's exactly the kind of bold move his ancient heroes would have tried on the battlefield. Instead of going head up, he went around and used their own weapons against them. For me, a great comparison to Ted's early content strategy is actually Netflix, specifically their early streaming days. You see, like Ted's WTCG, Netflix built their audience and brand by delivering older proven TV shows and movies, beginning with DVD and then later through streaming, all while waiting for the right technology breakthroughs to enable their next phase of growth. In Ted's case, it was the satellite. In Netflix's, it was faster internet so that they could stream movies and TV shows. And all the while, what was Netflix really offering? An alternative to networks and cable, right? You see, when I think of how a media company grows from a startup to a real big business, I like to picture it as climbing a ladder. Take Netflix. In their pre-streaming days, they were on the lowest rung of my imaginary ladder. But with years of data from DVD rentals and a growing base of happy recurring subscribers, they were climbing to the next rung, which was streaming licensed content along with co-producing early hit shows that were branded as Netflix shows like House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. They were paying for the shows to get made, but they didn't own those shows outright. From there, they parlayed their credibility with their original early programming into building a global in-house studio, focusing less on licensed material and more on their own productions to do what Ted always wanted to do, control his own destiny. That's how this kind of thing works. It's a ladder. You climb one rung at a time, and you can't just jump from the bottom rung to the top rung. That's not how these things work. It's an evolution, and it takes a lot of time. Now, I know this comparison is not necessarily apples to apples. It's more like apples to oranges, but those are both fruit. But remember in episode 1, when I said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. Well, get ready, because it's going to keep rhyming. Ted's programming strategy was just the beginning, and it didn't take long for him to start revolutionizing television with a series of bold programming innovations. The first came from Ted's hatred of wasted time. Now, I'm not sure if local TV stations still do this. I think they still do. But remember when you wake up accidentally around 4 or 4:30 in the morning to the Star Spangled Banner playing on television? Just a wake-up call for early risers signaling that NBC or ABC had started the day with a little touch of Americana. Well, Ted thought the idea that a channel would turn off was absolutely ridiculous. And not for the reasons you might think. He'd ask, quote, "Why do we go off the air overnight? Why do TV stations stop transmitting each night?" End quote. To Ted, leaving a third of the day unused felt like throwing money out the window. Not to mention there were insomniacs just like him who wanted to watch movies at 4 in the morning. So, like most curious people, Ted started asking around, and he finally got his answer. The reason was as predictable as it was lazy, because that's how it's always been done. It's not a good enough reason. Not on Ted Turner's WTCG when he fired back, quote, "We can't afford to do things like everybody else. We've got to do things differently. We've got to be like a cleaners that's open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. You've got to be open all the time," end quote. I mean, that's some of the best startup advice I've ever heard. At Turner Broadcasting, it was unacceptable to stick with the way things have always been done. Not if they wanted to win. So from that moment on, WTCG and later TBS weren't going off the air ever again. And Ted's thinking was really simple. Think about it. The world doesn't revolve around a 9-to-5 workday. So why should TV? And while Ted knew staying on the air all night wouldn't be some silver bullet that brought instant financial returns, it also made zero sense to turn their signal off all night. He was on the hunt for every possible viewer and edge. Channel 17 became the first TV station in the country to broadcast 24/7. Talk about a revolution, right? Often, it's not the big flashy changes that make a big difference. It's doing things a little differently, offering consumers something unique that no one else is even considering, and then paving a new path. These are the kinds of moves that change the game, and then they get people talking. Like, "Oh, did you watch that movie at 1 in the morning on TBS? Well, of course I did, because nothing was on ABC, NBC, or CBS. Exactly. Once Ted locked in his programming strategy, he then turned his attention to meeting the FCC's news requirement, which mandated that each TV station in the country had to air at least 7 hours of news each week. This isn't without a sense of irony, because less than a decade later, Ted would change the world with the launch of CNN. But in the early 1970s, he hated the news. He thought it was too negative. As Ted put it, quote, "Why was there never any good news on television? No one ever covered the Boy Scouts. The 1% of the population engaged in bad behavior got all the airtime," end quote. That's an interesting way to put it. At the time, one of his favorite sayings was, "No news is good news." So while the national networks aired their nightly news at 6:30, right after the local affiliates' news, Ted aired Star Trek. What better way to escape the daily negativity of Vietnam, crime, violence, inflation, and oil embargoes than with Star Trek? And when critics said he was making a big mistake, he fired back, saying, quote, "When you're the last place TV station in town, you can't make a mistake. They've already been made," end quote. There's a lot of truth in there, too. You have to zig when they zag. It's the only way to compete. Otherwise, you're just going to be a worse version of these existing titans. When it came to meeting the FCC's news requirement, Ted did the absolute bare minimum. He had no interest whatsoever in running a news department. That would have meant hiring anchors, reporters, cameramen, editors, graphics guys. It just didn't make any financial sense for his station. And just like how the networks prioritized entertainment over news in the 50s, which I covered in episode 1, Ted knew that airing old movies and TV reruns was a much better business than pouring money into news. There's no value of news right after it happens. 5 days later, you don't re-air the news. So instead of airing news at 6:30 like everyone else, Ted aired his version of the news at 3 in the morning.
Good morning. It's the 17 update early in the morning. I'm Bill Tush, sitting here inside your TV set with all the news.
Naturally, Ted bragged that WTCG's news won its time slot. Of course, they were the only station in Atlanta airing news or anything at that time. But let's be clear, this was Ted's version of the news, not the polished Walter Cronkite-style broadcasting that people were used to. It was simply about meeting the FCC's news requirement. For his news anchor, Ted tapped Bill Tush, a weatherman who'd been with WTCG since Ted bought the station. As anchor, Tush didn't exactly deliver hard-hitting journalism. He simply read the news straight from the Atlanta Constitution, adding a low production casualness in a charming way where everyone seemed to be in on the joke. WTCG's news felt more like Wayne's World than the CBS Evening News. In one episode, Tush even held a photo of Walter Cronkite over his face for the entire broadcast, poking fun at the seriousness of traditional news. Another time, Tush wore a gorilla suit while reading a story about a gorilla attack. One night, he even brought a German Shepherd on as his co-anchor, giving the dog peanut butter so that it would look like he was talking.
For more on that story, here's Rex. Rex?
Federal mediators saying
His newscast with a German Shepherd he called Rex the Wonder Dog became an early cable legend.
Do the weather later, Rex.
Now, to me, this sounds very Howard Stern-like. It's much different than the network's national news. But at 3 in the morning, who cares? Now, not everyone at WTCG loved the unserious version of the news, but Bill Tush was all in. He pushed back, saying, quote, "Where's it written how you have to do the news?" End quote. Who says the news has to be so serious? Certainly not Jon Stewart, Craig Kilborn, not even the FCC. In fact, Ted strongly agreed with Vice President Spiro Agnew's assessment in 1972 that the networks were a, quote, "tiny and close fraternity of privileged men, elected by no one and enjoying a monopoly sanctioned and licensed by the government," end quote. No argument from me on that one. There's 3 networks. The government basically lets them do whatever they want as long as they follow the rules. And in turn, they are printing money. Let's talk about who was not printing money. Let's shift gears to WTCG's money-making apparatus. How were they making money? So far, I've explained how Ted counter-programmed the networks and how he avoided wasting money on news. Both were very smart decisions. But let's be honest, none of that really matters if no one's watching and no money's coming through. Remember, being an indie UHF station at the time was a disaster in every conceivable way. So how were they actually bringing in revenue? Well, from day one, WTCG was advertising supported. And while Ted dreamed of one day owning a national network, his focus was on local advertising and turning his small, scrappy station into something bigger. To motivate his ad sales team, Ted leaned on the 5 Ps: programming, personnel, promotion, penetration, and profits. His ad sales team fought for every commercial, selling ad space to smaller advertisers who couldn't afford expensive spots on local affiliates, because a dollar is a dollar. Sometimes we overlook that part. There's legendary stories of Ted Turner, God-level salesman, jumping on desks to close deals. And if a buyer was a woman, Ted had no problem getting on his knees to beg. He sold WTCG's ad time rather creatively, even suggesting to advertisers that they run their commercials in color so they'd stand out against his black and white programming. Ted told advertisers, quote, "Our audience may not be big, but our viewers are way above the average viewer's mentality," end quote. And how did Ted know his viewers were above the average viewer's mentality? Quote, "It takes a genius to figure out how to tune a UHF set, dummy," end quote. Major companies like Procter & Gamble or Atlanta's own Coca-Cola, they want the biggest possible audiences for their products, which is why they would advertise with the big networks. There's only 3 of them. They're getting 75 million viewers. These were exactly the kinds of advertisers Ted always dreamed of landing. But for his small indie station, getting those names was going to be virtually impossible. Instead of wasting his time chasing these big CPG-type brands in New York City, he focused on direct mail advertisers. I'm talking about the kinds of commercials you never see on network TV. Infomercials for Ginsu knives or country music compilations.
Professional entertainers use Mr. Microphone for rehearsing. It's practical and great fun for the whole family.
To order, call 1-800-257-1234. In New Jersey, call 800-232-6966. Or to avoid COD charges, send $14.88 to Mr. Microphone, P.O. Box 7500, Atlanta, Georgia, 30357.
But those ads saved Ted's company. In classic Ted Turner fashion, for a man willing to spend whatever it took to win sailing competitions, he let his thriftiness at WTCG run wild, recalling, quote, "I took the letters to our mailroom and made them cut off the stamps so we could reuse them. I figured I made a dime on every stamp," end quote. It's legendary. He is reusing stamps, for God's sake. A lot of the all-time greats do stuff like this when they're getting started. Anything to save $1 or even make a dime. It's quirks like this that really draw me to Ted Turner's story because they show just how much the little things matter and how he's doing things differently in Atlanta than they would in New York. So as the networks are spending outrageous, basically unlimited amounts of money to produce 30 minutes of news every day, Ted Turner is reusing stamps just to stay in the game. These are the scrappy kinds of things founders have to do to survive and later to win. No pain, no gain, right? Well, remember, Ted's all in on WTCG. There's no backups or contingency plans. It's win or go home. Sid Pike, the general manager of WTCG, said that Ted, quote, has a tremendous desire to win. He doesn't like to lose. And if he does, he is one of the few people I have ever known who benefits from that loss. Ted asks himself, why did I lose? End quote. What an awesome, important lesson. You always have to ask why, or else you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes again. The networks never said, why are we not different than others? No, they just built another skyscraper next to their competitors. Ted's ad sales team was relentless, though. They were determined to sell every piece of ad space whenever they could. And when advertisers didn't bite, they got even more creative. Instead of running commercials, for example, they'd sell airtime, like to the godfather of soul himself, James Brown, who later had a weekly dance party TV show called Future Shock, which actually sounds pretty awesome.
He's now working on a billion seller. The undisputed king, the people's man, Jake is Brown. Merry Christmas! Hey, Merry Christmas! And right now I want to tell you that we got a beautiful show lined up for you, some beautiful guests. And you be here because we're going to blow your mind. Blow your mind and bring in another year and tell you about some beautiful things. Reminisce a little bit. We got a fantastic show, so get ready and get your mind together while I boogie a little bit. And I'll say, Merry Christmas on Payback, Future Shock. That's it. Payback.
Almost like we have extra slots of time. Let's sell them. And it really helped James Brown's career. I think that's pretty innovative as well. Anyway, somehow, just 14 months after the merger, Ted's indie UHF station, WTCG, turned its first profit. Keep in mind, just a year or so earlier, nobody was watching his channel. Most people in Atlanta didn't even know it existed. In just 2 years, Ted Turner's WTCG's potential audience grew from 5% of Atlanta homes to nearly 55%. And that number was growing fast, largely due to Ted's relentless drive and determination. Not just to emulate his father, but to surpass him in every possible way. And while Ted wasn't always the easiest guy to work for, everyone knew he was going to get the best out of you. One employee, Tom Ashley, recalled, quote, working with Ted was no bowl of cherries, but we all loved it. If you were pulling your weight, he pretty much left you alone. You had to be in the office at 8:30 every morning But even if you got in a half hour early, he was already there. Nobody told us he slept at the office. But in all the years I've been in this business, I've never seen a guy work harder, end quote. He continued, quote, at first, nobody took him seriously. Big mistake. He is eccentric, maybe even crazy, but Turner's bright, and he is driven, and he never gives up. I think Ted even knew people were laughing at him back then, but he was never going to give up, and now he's the guy with the last laugh, end quote. Here's my question for you. How many of your bosses can you say that about? Not many, right? That's what I thought. But if Ted told you he liked something you did, you could be positive that was real praise. Ted Turner's not someone capable of sugarcoating anything. Another colleague described him as, quote, like a hyperactive kid exploding into work in the morning if he hadn't slept on the pull-out couch in his office the night before, spouting poetry, singing song lyrics off key, roaming the halls to pump up the staff. Indeed, despite or perhaps because of his unorthodox behavior, his very presence seemed to inspire his troops to commit to a higher cause. Like, said one of them, military leaders who convinced their young troops to walk into lines of fire. Even the people he routinely pissed off or berated somehow managed to get caught up in this infectious spirit, end quote. Wow, this is so awesome. Ted has this unique blend of traits. Part of it's a Churchillian showman, and another part's relatable everyman. He could really adapt to any crowd and effortlessly charm people so that they were eating out of the palm of his hand. Or, depending on circumstances, make them want to kick him out of the party. Manners and good behavior? Not necessarily his strong suit. But let's be honest. Driven, super successful people, especially when they're younger, are very rarely normal. And I'm not excusing it, but they're almost always a little eccentric. I'm not justifying things, I'm just saying. One employee even asked Ted, quote, Ted, you strike me as someone who's living life on his own terms. What's your secret? Ted's reply, attitude, man. Attitude. Here's another great story. So there's a new employee at WTCG, and he's working the graveyard shift. One night, he sees a drunk guy stumbling through the office hallway, and he throws him out of the office. The next day, which is this guy's day off, his boss calls him and says, did you throw someone out of the station last night? Well, yes, sir, I did. Well, did you know that was the owner? So this new employee, graveyard shift, he's thinking, I'm going to be fired, and tells his boss, mail me my final paycheck and I'll be out of your hair. Then his boss laughs and says, no. In fact, Ted wants you to come in and meet him. So he comes in and Ted says in admiration, quote, so you're the one. I wish more people were like you. All I've got is these hippies around here, end quote. I love it. Imagine this kind of thing happening at one of the networks in New York, either then or now. It's impossible. And that's probably a good thing. But just know, Ted was always at WTCG. In fact, when he was running CNN, he lived at CNN. Okay, let's dive into cable again and the origin story for Ted's Superstation, which features a new strategy that would change TV forever.
Hey, look at us. We're the Superstation, WTCG Atlanta. Hey, look at us.
Now, it's worth repeating that in the early 1970s, the game was completely rigged in favor of the networks. There's only 3 of them, remember? We know that UHF channels like Ted's have no long-term future. And while WTCG wasn't a cable station just yet, the cable industry still remained stuck in a little bit of limbo. Remember earlier in this episode when I mentioned how the cable industry stalled out around 1968 because of the FCC and copyright issues? Well, those exact problems froze cable's growth from 1968 to 72. Because even though they agreed to it, cable providers didn't want to pay copyright fees for re-airing network programming that they pulled from their antenna towers. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. they weren't exactly swimming in cash. Think about it. Cable was a highly capital-intensive business, with its growth largely fueled by debt at the time. Paying for content in '68 was the last thing cable operators wanted to do. By 1972, cable was only in about 6 million homes, which is tiny compared to the networks who were pulling in 70 million viewers a night. But when operators finally gave in to the FCC's copyright rules, they got a much-needed boost. The FCC allowed them to bring in the nearest independent station as a bonus offering for their customers. And why would the FCC do this? Well, the government wanted more programming diversity outside of just the networks. But President Nixon also had his own agenda. He wanted more TV to feel grassroots and less influenced by what he saw as, quote, distracting influences of unfriendly commentators, end quote. Basically, Nixon felt the media was out to get him, which they were, and rightfully so. But this was his way of subtly pushing back. A key part of the FCC's new rules was that it allowed cable providers to establish regional franchises, giving stations like Ted's the opportunity to connect with cable systems outside of the local market. For Ted, this meant he could expand his station's reach beyond Atlanta for the very first time. This was huge. It was exactly what Ted was waiting for, and honestly, without this bonus from the FCC, WTCG really wasn't long for the world. But as part of a cable system, WTCG wouldn't just be a high UHF number on Atlanta's TV dials. No, now it could be a channel on cable systems across the South. And here's a kicker. WTCG had a major geographical advantage. You see, the Southeast didn't have many independent TV stations like Ted's, and the few that did exist, they certainly weren't programming with their audience in mind. They didn't offer the same mix of old movies, old TV shows, or live sports that Ted did, and they definitely weren't broadcasting 24/7. In a nutshell, the FCC's ruling gave Ted the opportunity to expand his station outside Atlanta and into countless more homes across the South. So when Ted heard about this ruling, he really jumped into action like all the greats do, meeting and wooing cable system operators across the South, pitching the benefit of adding Channel 17 to their cable systems. Y'all, this is how it's done. Relationships matter, then and now. It's about meeting people, building rapport, earning trust, and forming real connections. In the cable industry, it's doubly important. Remember, cable operators stuck together, and because they present a united front, they're up against the man, the dominant networks, Hollywood, and sometimes even the United States government who controls what goes on the air. So for Ted to survive and even grow, he needed to get his station onto these cable systems. And if he couldn't, well, he was screwed. Those were the stakes, plain and simple. To paraphrase Ellis Boyd Redding, get busy growing or get busy dying. Ted's future was cable. So Ted hit the road with his trademark enthusiasm, traveling from Tuscaloosa to Knoxville to Tallahassee and back again, wooing and winning over cable operators with his electrifying enthusiasm. You see, Ted was offering them something New York's networks couldn't, an alternative. It was a partnership. Cable operators needed new content, and station owners like Ted needed distribution. In no time, 73 cable systems across 5 southern states were carrying Channel 17 into 312,000 homes, nearly matching his reach in Atlanta. Within a year, viewership tripled. Channel 17 was no longer a struggling UHF indie station. It had transformed into a southern cable network. Ted Turner was just 32 years old. At this point, WTCG didn't know how many people were actually watching the station. Rating companies didn't measure cable yet and wouldn't for years, but they used a different way to gauge success: fan mail. Every day, they poured through hundreds of letters to the station. Fan mail for news anchor Bill Tush, professional wrestlers with Georgia Championship Wrestling, and orders for their infomercials. And as Ted sorted through it, they noticed something unique. Half of the mail came from outside of Atlanta. That's how he knew cable was working for him. Now, today, if you were to ask someone over the age of 50, especially in the South, about Ted Turner's TBS, it's very likely you might get a response of, "You mean the Superstation?" Why, yes, the Superstation. Ted Turner's freaking Superstation. You see, the idea of a Superstation first came from Don Anderson, who at the time was a vice president at the National Cable Television Association. While in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, Anderson watched as their struggling local cable system threw what was really a Hail Mary, boldly bringing in New York Yankee games via microwave tower for cable subscribers. The next morning, after the first game, a line stretched for blocks outside of the station as people waited in line to subscribe to cable. Anderson's eureka moment was realizing that sports could transform cable's future by drawing dedicated viewers to their systems. So he met with Ted and suggested the Atlanta Braves could do for Channel 17 what the Yankees had done for Wilkes-Barre's cable system. But in order to take Channel 17 to the next level, both in Atlanta and across the South, Ted first needed to secure the rights to even broadcast Braves games. This was the type of bold power move that could turn Channel 17 from a mere station into a super station. And while most people probably would have studied all their options for months, consult with committees or even consultants, Ted didn't. Instead, he impulsively swooped in and grabbed the broadcast rights from Atlanta's market leader and NBC affiliate, WSB, by making the Braves owners an offer they couldn't refuse. His offer was simple. He'd air 3 times more Atlanta Braves games on Channel 17 than NBC. And because Ted's station had nothing but airtime to fill, he could promise the Braves anything they wanted without ever needing to ask a committee, a board, or anyone else for approval. Just like Frank Sinatra, Ted was doing it his way. And when moving fast, these things matter. It's like when Zuck got Instagram over a weekend in 2012. Founder mode. Lead, follow, or get out of the way. Now, this is and has always been one of the major advantages of being an owner, operator, founder. You see, getting the rights to air Braves games was just the start of Ted Turner's sports revolution. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this specific move was a game changer. By expanding into cable systems across the South, while also securing the broadcast rights to Braves games, Ted transformed Channel 17 into a regional TV powerhouse. From there, he hired Don Anderson, the man behind his sports idea, and together with Ted's protege, Terry McGurk, the three hit the road, pitching cable operators across the South their own version of a Trojan horse. Atlanta Braves games exclusively on cable. Traveling from town to town, they promoted the Braves as America's team, convincing cable operators to carry his soon-to-be nickname, Super Station. It was in these meetings where Ted earned the reputation for being cable before cable was cool. Now, I need to emphasize this once again. All of this is happening before satellite technology would allow cable stations to broadcast nationwide. At the time, everything is more regional, working on a cable system by cable system basis, on a town by town basis. But the point remains, Ted was an owner and operator who really wanted to beat the networks. And most importantly, he wanted to do it on cable. To cable operators, Ted was their programming savior. He was giving them a channel with live, unique programming like Braves games and professional wrestling, along with a vast library of familiar movies and TV shows. What was there not to want? And in turn, Ted was giving cable subscribers an alternative to network television. an alternative they never really realized that they had or needed. In less than 3 years, Ted went from owning a struggling UHF station with just 1 month left to live to owning a cable station with the rights to air Atlanta Braves games. It's a borderline miracle. But here's the thing. Cable was still starved for programming, not just original programming, but any programming. To have imagined a future with hundreds of cable channels would have been insane. And yet, cable operators still needed more entrepreneurs like Ted to make these new channels and give people a reason to subscribe. They needed bold difference makers willing to bet it all on their programming dreams. They needed mavericks, the square pegs in the round holes. So it's no wonder why we call these guys the Cable Cowboys. They were fearless risk takers, betting it all on a cable dream at a time when capital wasn't cheap and the obstacles seemed infinite. TCI's John Malone, who I'll discuss at length in future episodes, said, quote, "The cable guys fell in love with Ted," end quote. Comcast founder Ralph Roberts recalled first meeting Ted, who asked him, quote, "Do you hate me?" Roberts responded, "Why, Ted?" "Because you don't have Channel 17 on your cable box," end quote. Roberts quickly added Channel 17 to his Mississippi cable system and immediately saw results, saying, quote, "We thought it was the greatest thing in the world. We had cable systems in Mississippi, and it helped us gain subscriptions." He's smart as a fox. Part of his charm is to get you to help him get what he wants, end quote. Incredibly, it took Ted Turner 2 years to take this failing UHF station and turn it into a valuable regional cable television franchise. In his letter to shareholders in 1973, he wrote, quote, "Channel 17 was now firmly established as the leading independent television station in the Southeast. From shit to Shinola in 2 short years. That's pretty damn strong," end quote. Their earnings were impressive, as the TV station's revenues in 1972 were up $1.783 million, or 177%, over 1971, with a net income of $1.645 million, or $1.11 per share in 1972, an incredible 78% increase over 71. Ted's attorney, Tench Cox, said about their success by 1973, quote, "Ted quickly got Channel 17 in shape, and WRET in Charlotte followed along afterward, and he was really set. Those 2 properties alone could have carried him for the rest of his life. He had won big, but he couldn't leave it alone. He kept seeing something else out there," end quote. To me, that last line is really key. He couldn't leave it alone. He kept seeing something else out there. Ted didn't want to just be a budding regional station. He had to be more. He needed to be more, which is when he revealed, quote, "I'm going after the networks," end quote. But first, he'd need more original programming. Programming he could own. Like a sports franchise. Like the Atlanta Braves. On the next episode of Media Moguls, we're going to dive headfirst into home plate with Ted Turner's game-changing acquisition that changed sports ownership and TV broadcasting forever. Ted Turner's Atlanta Braves and the sports television revolution on the next episode. Until then, I'm Webb Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.